Chinese characters. I don't mean Chinese characters like Fu Manchu. I mean the Chinese writing. There's really fascinating studies going on. You know, Chinese writing is not an alphabet like ours. It's pictures, right? It's little pictographs that they put together that symbolize different things. And what's fascinating is that when we have in English, when we have a compound word that goes back a long time, we don't always think about where all the elements of that word came from, right? If somebody said to you, well, how do you break this word down? We don't do that. We just think of the word as a whole. And in the Chinese characters, you have the same thing. They look at a word and they say, okay, here's a word, and this word means righteousness. And it's a picture. It's just a whole picture. They're used to looking at it that way. But missionaries have begun to ask them to break it down for them, to say, okay, here's this picture that means righteousness. It's comprised of a number of other pictures. What are the pictures that you see? What are the pictures? And this is an ancient language. In fact, the Chinese written language is probably about as old as the stories in the Bible, as the writings of Moses. They're that ancient. And so they say, okay, so they sit down with these Chinese, and they say, hey, explain this to me. Break down this picture that means righteousness. And they said, well, that's weird. We've never done that before. It's not really how it works. I said, well, just do it. What are the pictures that comprise the picture of righteousness? And they say, okay, well, this is a picture of a lamb. And this is a picture that means you. And so it's a lamb over you. Why? Why does that mean righteousness? And they say, we have no idea. That's just what it is. It's just a picture. That's why breaking it down doesn't make sense. And the missionary says, did you know that about the time of the Chinese writing, God was teaching the Israelites that their righteousness came when they shed the blood of a lamb, and that covered them? And the Chinese people say, that's amazing. I wonder if there was some connection. I wonder if there was some, there's no way, they say. How could we didn't have any contact with the Semitic peoples. How could we have that same thing? Is it possible the stories are in their culture? You find more and more of these kind of pictures and images in the Chinese writing that point to things. The word for evil. The word for evil is a picture of a tree and a picture of a snake under the tree. You ask the Chinese man, why? Why is that the picture for evil? He says, I have no idea. It's just always been that way. And the missionary says, did you know we have a story that in the very beginning of creation, that's how evil began? The Chinese man says, that's amazing. That's absolutely incredible. Here's one of the issues. There's a suggestion, a guy named Ardman, and we're not going to go into it, but there's a guy named Ardman who actually suggests that our dates are wrong. Prior to Solomon, that our dates are off by 1,000 years, that there's a 1,000-year error. And what's fascinating about his argument is that if you go back 1,000 years, you find, in fact, around the time, if you take the time that we think the Exodus is now, you push it back 1,000 years earlier, we find an Egypt that flourishes and then one day collapses. We find stories of a group of people that crossed across the desert. We find archaeology of a nomadic group of people that were in the desert for long periods of time. We find, following that forward, stories. We find, in fact, that Jericho has been destroyed possibly more than once. And then, in fact, there may be evidence of Jericho that's much cleaner than evidence we've seen otherwise that's 1,000 years earlier than we think it ought to be. You find ruins that look potentially like Sodom and Gomorrah having been destroyed by an earthquake and ensuing fires. In other words, if you go back 1,000 years, you find evidence for things. It's just that we're looking in the wrong when. That's Ardman's argument. He might be right. He might be wrong. It's going to take a lot more research and study. But that's a possibility, that we're looking at the wrong when, not the wrong where. That could happen because we're talking about prior to Solomon, when everything gets a little bit harder to date, doesn't it? It's a possibility. Or maybe we're looking in the wrong places. There's also arguments that we're just looking in the wrong places. That we've got the Mount Sinai location all wrong. That we've got the crossing of the desert completely confused. There's even some, and I wouldn't go this far, but some who argue that Egypt wasn't Egypt. It was a different place called Egypt at the time. I wouldn't go that far, but we are talking many thousands of years ago. It's not impossible. So, there's possible answers. I will say this. The following impossible things are now regarded as definite possibilities. What I mean by that is there was a day that people said, these are things we know cannot be true. Scripture said these are true, but they can't be true. They're proof that Scripture is false. We now have at least found enough evidence to make these definite possibilities. definitely moved out of the impossible category, writing in the time of Moses. For many years, people said Moses could not have written the first 5 books because no one was writing at the time of Moses. And furthermore, even if they were writing, there were no codes of law. There's no evidence that there were any codes of law prior to that time. And if Moses had these laws from God, it would have affected other people. And they said that, and they said that, and they said that until they found a tablet of Hammurabi and the law that he had written down about the same time as Moses. They said, oh, well, I guess there might have been writing and there might have been laws. Could be. Guess we have to admit that's a possibility. Jericho's collapse. People said there is no Jericho. Actually, everybody believes there's a Jericho now. There's questions about exactly how it may have been destroyed and whether you believe this evidence or that. There's a lot of contention about it between believers and unbelievers, actually. Believing archaeologists and unbelieving archaeologists have a very different viewpoint. But what's interesting is they used to say Jericho didn't exist. And now even those who argue against it say, well, okay, yeah, it's there. Ai is another city that was defeated when they first entered Canaan. Sodom and Gomorrah, same kind of thing. They used to say, no Sodom and Gomorrah, there isn't any. Now they're pretty sure they not only found it, but they found the 5 plain cities that are also referred to right around there. This is interesting. This is the Amarna tablets were found in 1886 in an ancient capital of Egypt. They date from the 14th century BC and are from officials of Palestine and Syria who were upset because of the attacking Habiru. These tablets describe a disorganized turmoil among the states there and contain requests for Egyptian assistance and troops, precisely the situation in Palestine resulting from the Israelite invasion under Joshua. In other words, they find evidence of chaos that would mirror what would have happened when Joshua came in and suddenly started taking over these lands. And they find the evidence that this was done by a wandering people called the Habiru, which W.F. Albright believes is another term for Hebrew. So he believes, here it is, evidence of the conquering of the promised land. One of the things that people said there's no evidence for, doesn't exist. But let's talk about post-Solomon, because this is very interesting. And the question is, if you decide that you're going to say there's no evidence of the Exodus and it doesn't sound likely, therefore it didn't happen, let's see how well that approach has worked. Every one of the things I'm about to mention for you, as we go through this list of about 9 or 10 things, every one of these is things that the world said didn't exist. They said the only evidence of this is in Scripture. There's no evidence of this anywhere else. It's only in Scripture, and that's not a reliable enough source, so we don't believe these existed. And then they found them. So let's just walk through some of these things. Number 1, okay, this is how they look at it. No evidence, therefore the Bible must have made it up. Okay, that's what they're saying. So let's look at the things they said. One thing they said for many, many years was the Hittites. The Hittites are mentioned 30 or 40 times in the Old Testament. Who are the Hittites? There is no such people as the Hittites, said everybody. They don't exist. There's no evidence of this group of people called the Hittites. There's nothing at all. We can't find anything about them. There are no Hittites. Until the late 1800s and early 1900s, when they found evidence, in fact, of a huge empire with castles, fortresses, tablets, and that they referred to kings that are mentioned in Scripture as being Hittite. And they refer to themselves by the name Katet, which again, W.F. Albright believes is simply another derivation of the word Hittite. And then at that point they said, oh, okay, I guess there might be some Hittites. Archaeologist and author Randall Pierce says once they were finally deciphered, this is the writings that they were looking at, it was announced to the world that the Hittites had been found. The rediscovery of this lost people, one of the most outstanding achievements in Near Eastern archaeology, now serves as a caution to those who doubt the historicity of particular biblical accounts. But they didn't take that warning. They didn't heed that warning.